Try this. Close your eyes for a second and go back. Not the story someone told you 100 times at Christmas dinner. Not the photograph you've seen so often it feels like a memory. The real thing. Something you saw from the inside, with your own eyes, that nobody had to tell you about. Most people land somewhere around 3 or 4 years old. Before that, nothing. Just a wall. Here's the part that should bother you. Your brain wasn't waiting until 3 to start working. By the time you were 2, maybe younger, you were already learning faster than you ever will again in your life. So where did it go?
In 1899, Sigmund Freud sat with exactly this puzzle and gave it a name: infantile amnesia. Not a disorder, not something broken in a few unlucky people. Every single human being who has ever lived has it, in every culture anyone has ever studied. And the strange part is where the wall sits. It's not at birth. It's not even close to birth. A baby just a few months old can already recognize its mother's face in a crowd, tell her voice apart from a stranger's, remember which toy makes which sound if you show it enough times. By 18 months, most children have some kind of language. By 2, they're building sentences, mapping the layout of a house, learning who's kind and who to avoid.
None of that looks like a mind incapable of memory. It looks like the opposite. A toddler's brain is arguably the most powerful learning machine that will ever exist inside your skull. And yet almost none of it survives. The years when you were absorbing the world faster than you ever will again are also the years you'll never get back. Not through therapy, not through hypnosis, not through trying harder. So if the machine was working, something else has to be going wrong. And for over a century, nobody could prove what.
The first real clues didn't come from adults trying to remember their own childhoods. They came from asking children directly before they'd had time to forget. Carol Peterson, a psychologist at Memorial University of Newfoundland, sat down with more than 100 kids between 4 and 13 and asked them for their earliest memory. Then she came back. Years later, she asked again. What she found didn't look like fading. It looked like replacement. A 5-year-old's earliest memory, when checked again at 7, often wasn't the same event anymore. The old memory hadn't dimmed. It had been quietly swapped out for a newer one, and the child had no idea the swap had even happened. Ask a young child for their earliest memory, and you're not measuring a fixed point. You're measuring something still moving. Around the same time, at Emory University, Patricia Bauer ran a more direct test. She brought 3-year-olds into her lab and asked them about real things that had actually happened: a trip to the zoo, a birthday party, specific, checkable events from the past few months. 2 years later, she brought some of those same children back and asked again. At 5 years old, they still had it. Roughly 60% of what they described at 3 was still there, intact. Then she waited 6 years and asked once more. By 8 years old, most of it was gone. Not faded. Gone. Bauer had a simple way of putting what she'd found. Something was happening at age 7. Between Peterson's work and Bauer's, a picture started to form that nobody expected. Childhood amnesia isn't a slow fade that starts the day you're born and gets a little worse every year. It's closer to a wave that keeps rolling forward, arriving later and later as you grow, and quietly erasing whatever memories are still sitting in its path when it gets there. Which raised the obvious next question. What, physically, is doing the erasing?
The answer came from an unlikely place. Not from watching children at all, but from the inside of a mouse's brain. Paul Frankland, a neuroscientist at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, had spent years studying something called neurogenesis, the brain's habit of manufacturing brand new neurons throughout life. Most of that manufacturing happens in one small structure, the hippocampus, the exact region responsible for laying down new memories in the first place. Here's what Frankland noticed. In early childhood, the hippocampus produces new neurons at an explosive rate, far higher than it ever will again. And that rate falls sharply right around the same age children stop forming memories they'll keep for life. His hypothesis was almost uncomfortably simple. Every new neuron has to wire itself into the hippocampus's existing circuitry to become useful. But that circuitry is also where old memories are stored, physically, as patterns of connections. Wiring in a flood of new neurons doesn't just add capacity, it disturbs what's already there, like constantly renovating a library while people are still trying to find their books. Frankland didn't just propose this, he tested it directly in mice. He took adult mice whose neurogenesis had already slowed down the way an adult's does and artificially sped it back up. Their existing memories started disappearing, exactly like a toddler's. Then he did the reverse. He took infant mice and suppressed their neurogenesis artificially down toward adult levels.
Those infant mice stopped forgetting. They started keeping memories the way an adult would. He'd found the dial. Turn it one way and a grown mind starts losing memories like a child's. Turn it the other way and a child's mind starts keeping them like an adult's. It wasn't a metaphor anymore. It was a mechanism.
But here's where it gets stranger. In 2018, Frankland's own lab went back and asked a harder question. If those early memories are being lost, are they actually destroyed or just buried? Using a technique called optogenetics, they identified the exact cluster of neurons in an infant mouse's brain that had encoded a specific memory, one that should, by every normal test, have been completely forgotten. Then they switched those neurons back on, directly with light. The mouse reacted. It responded to a memory it had no ordinary way of accessing anymore. The information hadn't been deleted. It was still sitting there, physically, in the tissue. What had vanished wasn't the memory itself. It was the path leading back to it.
So is this purely a biological clock, ticking the same way in every brain on Earth? Not quite. Wang, a psychologist at Cornell, spent years comparing the earliest memories of American and Chinese adults, then children. The differences weren't small. Americans tended to describe long, detailed, emotionally vivid memories with themselves at the center. A specific afternoon, a specific feeling. Their earliest memory, on average, sat around 3.5 years old. Chinese participants gave shorter, plainer accounts, usually about ordinary shared moments, routines, family, group activities, rather than a personal starring role. And their earliest memory landed, on average, nearly a year later than the American one.
Same species, same hippocampus, same neurogenesis curve, roughly. Different wall. Wang's explanation traces back to something almost embarrassingly simple. Culture teaches you very early how to talk about yourself or whether to talk about yourself at all. A child raised to narrate their own life as a story with themselves as the main character seems to build a searchable index for that story earlier. A child raised to see their life as part of something collective builds that index later or differently. The biology sets the general shape of the wall. What you were taught about your own importance seems to decide exactly where it stands.
So think back again to that question at the start. Your earliest memory, the wall you hit around 3 or 4. It was never really about your memory failing you at the start of your life. For a while, it was working better than it ever would again. Faces, language, rooms, routes, the exact tone of a voice that meant safety. All of it was going in. Then, quietly, over months and years, an explosion of brand new neurons rewired the exact shelves where all of that was sitting. Not to punish you, just because that is what a growing brain does to make room for everything still coming. Somewhere in that rewiring, most of it became unreachable, not deleted. The mouse in Frankland's lab is the reason we know the difference. Unreachable. Which means somewhere in you, right now, there may still be a version of yourself who was held before you had a word for what holding was, who heard a specific voice in a specific room and felt, for the first time, something like safe. You will never get back there. No amount of trying will open that door again. But for a while, before you could speak, before you could ask, someone was there. And some part of you, buried under everything that came after, was there for it too.